Good morning, everybody in Europe. Good afternoon, everybody who is listening our EU SME Centre webinar from China. Today, we will speak about how to avoid business risk in China, and it will be a guide to due diligence for EU SMEs. In the past, we have conducted several webinars on this topic. Today, our perspective will be a little bit different. But before we move to the agenda, to our speaker, and to presentation itself, let me firstly mention a few technical points. On your panel, you will have a special window with the questions where you can send us during the webinar or at the end of the webinar any question which will be answered by our speaker, today's speaker. And if we do not manage, due to the number of questions, answer your questions during the webinar, we will address it later on via the email. I believe that many of you are already familiar with EU SME Centre in China. However, for those who are joining us for the first time, let me introduce services and the purpose of EU SME Centre. EU SME Centre is a project funded by European Union, and its purpose is to help small and medium-sized enterprises from Europe come to China to invest or export their products. We are helping and supporting those SMEs via several tools, several services. First is the Ask the Expert service, when via our website you can pass to us any questions related to establishment of company, business models related to the standards of conformity, business development, and so on. On the same topics, we provide face-to-face consultations, either here in our Beijing office or during our trainings or seminars in China or in Europe. We have brought Knowledge Center. It's our library with more than 100 publications, reports, and case studies and guidelines on sectors and subsectors, which covers opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises. We provide trainings, as I mentioned, both in Europe and in China, webinars as this one. We organize matchmaking events, and I would like to mention our e-learning modules, for example, quiz, be ready for China. We have useful databases, database of exhibitions, service providers like law firms, accounting companies, tax advisors, and not least, we provide hot desking here in Beijing in our office in Beijing. Now to the topic, but first let me introduce our today's speaker, Mr. Jeremy Gordon. Mr. Jeremy Gordon is author of recently published Risky Business in China, a Guide to Due Diligence book. He serves as a director of China Business Service and China Edge, and more than 20 years worked with government departments, financial institutions, and major corporates on strategy and risk and business development in China. So now it's the moment I pass the floor to Jeremy, and he will introduce what he is going to speak during today's webinar. Jeremy.
Great, thank you very much, Ludmila, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. I'm sitting in London on a bright sunny day rather than in the smog of Beijing, which is one of the risks we might touch on today, is the environmental risk. But what I'd like to do is to give a bit of an introduction to why I think people need to pay more attention to risk management in China, and I mean risk management as a core part of corporate strategy, not as something to think about afterwards, and particularly not something to think about after a problem has occurred. I want to try and provide a little bit of context, because I think a lot of people misunderstand both the opportunity and the risk that is available in China. So we'll talk a little bit about China in the context of some of the other major markets. In a very practical way, I will outline some of the tools that are available, online, offline, things that you can do yourself, and the sorts of things that you might want to bring in an external specialist to do. There are lots of tools available. And then in conclusion, I'll talk about what I think the market demands right now in terms of a response from international companies. And we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. But if you have questions during my presentation, please feel free to write them on the panel, and Ludmilla will pop up occasionally and let us know if there are opportunity to answer. So can we go on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, at this moment, I would like to launch our first poll, because we are as well interested about your experience, and Jeremy will then comment on this and share his view. And our first poll is about your experience. What do you consider the main risks in China? And we gave 3 options. First one is IP theft, means IPR, rights theft, fraud, bribery, or last one, bribery, corruption. So we are looking for your votes and coming. Okay, a few more seconds. I'm closing it, and I must say that the results are very much equal one to another. It's like 58% for IP theft, 52% for fraud, and 52% for bribery and corruption. Jeremy, what's your view on these results? What's your experience?
Well, I mean, it's no surprise that people worry about these things, and you know, one of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute is that many of these risks are the same risks that we face anywhere we do business in the world, not just in China and not just in developing markets, but all around the world. You know, the global financial crisis, fraud, mis-selling from the banks, bad debts that are hidden off the balance sheet. You know, these are things that we don't just find in China, and I'll come to the reasons why that's important. And that poll was interesting. Actually, I suspect that the reality is that the risks are somewhat higher than people suspect. Kroll did a survey in 2012, Kroll being a big risk management company, where 80% of the respondents reported fraud exposure in their China operations. So that's kind of a recognition that that risk exists in their business. But fully 67% of companies surveyed said that they were actually affected by fraud in their China operations in that year. So that's quite a significant number. And the other thing worth thinking about when people decide whether or not they want to spend money on risk management is that in the Kroll sample, companies on average lost 1.2% of their revenue to fraud. So this is not an academic issue. It's a real issue that impacts most companies operating in China and you know, many companies operating around the world. So you know, these are significant issues with a big impact on the bottom line. But the good news is that it is possible to mitigate and manage those risks. But before we get into the detail of those particular risk aspects, we'll just look at China in the context of some of the other BRICS companies. So I think you're all familiar with, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS. And one of the things I did for the book was just to sort of benchmark my own perception of risk against some of the other major markets that are in this BRICS family. And what struck me was that while every day you read about China risk in the papers, or as it turns out, you either read about China opportunity or you read about China risk. Very seldom do people put the two together, which is what I'm trying to do. So actually, there is no doubt that China is a risky market. There are risks in the market, but it is not an outlier in terms of its risk profile when you compare it to some of the other BRICS economies. So in terms of economic freedom, China ranks at 137. So it's ahead of Russia, just behind India and Brazil. The World Bank has its annual ease of doing business rankings, which I always laugh at because I don't think anything is easy about doing business, particularly in places like China. But China comes out at number 96. So actually relatively positive in relation to the other BRICS countries. Transparency International is a different organization which has its own ranking about perceptions of corruption. And as we saw in our own little survey, that there is a perception that corruption is risk in China, and indeed it is, not just for foreign companies or Chinese companies, but for officials in the anti-corruption drive. And again, China comes in at number 80, behind Brazil, but ahead of India and Russia. And yet, although Russia is down there at the bottom, this is an adding up of perceptions of risk of corruption being somewhat difficult or extremely difficult. And interestingly, Russia scored very high on the extremely difficult scale, but overall comes lower down the rankings. But the interesting thing for me is that while all of these markets, and again, not just the BRICS, but we're looking at the BRICS for now, all of these markets have these risks. The difference for China is that China is not optional. It is such a big market, such an important strategic market, that for most companies, they simply cannot afford to ignore it. If you do try to ignore China, you obviously miss potentially an enormous opportunity. You give your competitors the ability to attack that opportunity without you, and potentially you let your Chinese competitors grow up strength in their home market and then come and fight against you at home. So the risk in China is not unique. It shouldn't scare people off completely. These are the same risks that people find in other parts of the world. However, there are reasons why it's particularly important to address these risks in the context of China, and I'll come on to those. So if we can move on to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
So there are those kind of criminal risks that we've just discussed, but they're not the only things that we consider when we talk about business risk. There are all sorts of challenges that we have to address in our day-to-day business, both at a strategic level and at a tactical level. And I found it quite interesting over the years to keep an eye on the various business confidence surveys that come out of China. But the European Chamber does one, and a couple of the US organizations, the US China Business Council and the US Chamber of Commerce, AmCham in China. They produce these annual surveys. And I looked at the key issues in the 2013 reports, and I tried to classify them according to certain themes. And although they have different rankings, different issues at number 1, 2, 3, basically the EU and US companies are seeing the same sorts of problems. And the biggest risk is rising costs. That's the biggest business challenge. And this has a very direct impact on risk, because where you have rising costs, you tend to have falling profits. And where you have falling profits, you have people trying to cut corners to reduce their cost and increase their profit. And when that happens, people start to make mistakes, they start to commit fraud, they bribe for contracts, and all these sorts of things start to happen. So the rising cost is a problem on a corporate level, but it also means that you have to pay more attention to managing the underlying risks. In the same way, the slowing growth means that those targets that head office gave you a year or 18 months ago are much harder to achieve. And where you have targets that are hard to achieve, people become worried they're not going to get their bonuses. And where people are motivated by hitting targets to get bonuses, they also are motivated to cut corners, break the rules, break the code of conduct, even commit fraud, book sales that haven't actually come through in order to achieve their personal targets. So again, another feeder for risk. In the same way, there's more competition. All around Europe, certainly, but all around the world, we've had slowing growth, not just in China, although Chinese growth remains pretty good, even if it's 7.5%, or in the third quarter 7.3%, and they're hoping it will stay above 7%, which is their red line, if you like. But more competition is arising because everybody is looking to China as a place around the world to grow their business. But at the same time, this has come through very strongly. In the latest US survey, Chinese or competition, and particularly Chinese company competition in China, was brought out as the top challenge this year for American companies in China. So these Chinese companies are coming through very strong. They're very good at competing on cost and finding innovative ways to grow in a slow growth environment. Human resources, getting the right people with the right sort of qualifications is very tough. And again, it means there's a lot of competition for good people in the marketplace. And it's important that as those people compete for the job in your business, you check out that their qualifications are real and that they're really who they say they are, and they're capable of doing what they claim to be able to do. On a sort of higher level, we've got protectionism. China is a difficult place to do business on a good day, but sometimes there's a feeling that the government makes it harder than it should be with, whether it's labeling regulations, custom processes, or the sort of actions we've seen against some of the big international companies in the pharmaceutical, automotive, and other industries around the anti-monopoly law. These are big issues that cause real concern, not only at a company level, but also for the European Chamber and the American Chamber. And if you follow these things, you'll find that the European Chamber normally writes very nice, polite, relatively soft papers for issuing to the Chinese government. But on the AML issue, the anti-monopoly law issue, there was a very strongly worded statement that came out recently saying that this is a real problem that needed to be addressed. And of course, we have legal issues. So these are the big picture rule of law issues. We do business in Europe with an assumption that the courts will independently stand behind our contracts and that we're all on a level playing field. In China, we talk about there being a political rule of law, and the courts are controlled by the party. Many businesses and business people have links to the party, and there's a national interest at play, which we need to be aware of. Of course, there's also this massive anti-corruption drive that is catching, Xi Jinping said, tigers and flies, so what we'd term the big fish and the small fry. And we've already discussed to some extent intellectual property protection being a risk. Although I have to say it's improving. As long as you as companies take the right steps to protect your intellectual property, monitor what's happening with it, then you can go a long way to protecting it. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Ludmilla. So I talked about why China is different, although it's the same in terms of many of the risks. I think it's important to understand the amplification effect of China. China is now the second largest economy of the world. It's the largest trader of goods in the world. And for 120 countries and regions, it's their largest trading partner. And many European countries, the UK included, are doing their level best to try and increase what is typically a rather imbalanced trade picture with China. But of course, as a country, as a European Union, as a country or as a company, the more your reliance is on China, the greater your China risk becomes, and the more important it is that you manage the risk of doing business in China. You cannot ignore it, just in the same way that you can't ignore the opportunity of China. So we talk about that as being the integration risk. The more integrated you are with China, the better for the opportunity, but also the greater the risk. So I was just talking the other day about Australia. They've been a big beneficiary of China's boom, and one of the ways in which they've benefited is from selling lots of coal to feed China's steel and energy industry. But China's just said it's going to slap tariffs on imported coal as an environmental protection measure. So you have now all these Australian coal producers and traders in a blind panic, thinking suddenly they're going to lose all of that business they've had from China. So again, have they really thought in advance about the integration risk that they face doing business with China? On the other side, we look at the risk of amplification inside China, and it's, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have been to China to do business, and when you're looking to manufacture something or source something from China, very often you find these incredible industry clusters. There's a massive list of them you can find on the internet. But just as an example, Xintang is the jeans capital of the world, making 260 million pairs of jeans a year. There's another town called Gurao, which makes most of the bras and pants around the world. 80% of the local economy does it. 200 million pairs of bras a year. So when you start thinking, if you're in the jeans business and the vast majority of production of your industry around the world happens in one place in China, that's an incredible concentration of not only know-how but also the physical means of manufacture, the supply chain that makes the whole industry work in a low-cost and efficient way. China, of course, has also got a fantastic logistics infrastructure, high-speed rail, pretty good roads, massive port infrastructure, all the services that back it up. You cannot, and I've done this with a client, you cannot simply pick it up and move it to Vietnam or Bangladesh and expect it to work in the same way. That whole ecosystem doesn't exist in the same way. So a China plus one strategy is simply not enough in order to manage that China risk and the China integration risk. You've got to think about these things, the long-term plan B, as well as how to take advantage of today's opportunity. And of course, at a company level, China is a key part of people's growth plans. So if you fall down on delivering that part of the plan relating to China, for many companies, their whole plan will fall down. And in the latest EU Chamber survey, 64% of European companies said that China was an important part of their global strategy. And fully 86% of European companies said that they were considering expansion into China. So there's no doubt that this focus on China is a way that people are looking to create opportunities, but it's also something that we need to think about in terms of how we manage the risk that comes along with it. The next slide, please. And one of the reasons that China becomes a complicated place in order to manage risks is because things work a little bit differently in China. We have this expression in English, a bad workman blames his tools. And I like to use that analogy in China. If you take a set of European tools to China, or as I find in my house, if I take out a screwdriver that has the wrong head on it for the screw I'm trying to screw in, then although it's a very nice, high-quality German-made screwdriver, and it's a very nice, high-quality screw, the head of the screw doesn't fit, and I have to go back out, start again from scratch. Well, it's the same in China. You recognize these risks that you deal with at home, but you find that the way in which you manage them doesn't work when you get into China. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some of them are cultural. And even traveling around Europe with the best will in the world, as we're one big family, sometimes we find it difficult to understand each other. My father-in-law is German. We don't always see eye to eye. In the same way, when I go to China, I have to moderate my thinking and make sure that I understand local perceptions, not just push my own perception. So we talk about things like guanxi, these relationships that people have to help oil the works of business. But these are deep relationships that often go back generations in China. They're not things that we as foreigners can simply develop over dinner or a few trips into China. But we do have to understand these guanxi networks in order to see how our business associates in China work and how we can try to influence things when they start to go wrong. You know, who do we talk to? We have to understand their guanxi networks, even if we don't have our own. In the same way, you know, people think that maybe face is a soft cultural aspect of business in China, but actually, you know, this is something people talk about on a daily basis in China. You know, mei mianzi, you know, I've got no face, I've lost face. This is something that happens every day. I was at a conference recently where a Portuguese panelist next to me had been selling 2.5 million euros of real estate to some Chinese for their investment visas. And he left his team to conclude the deal, came back the next day and said, right, where's the money? And they said, well, we don't understand it. The Chinese just left. And he was obviously quite annoyed, but tried to find out the reason. And he found out that these Chinese buyers had the next day bought a similar property just up the road. And the reason they hadn't bought the property from him is because he hadn't turned up to the contract signing. And the Chinese felt that they had lost face, and therefore they didn't think that they were being taken seriously, they felt insulted, and they didn't feel comfortable doing the deal. So they went up the road where they were shown a little bit more cultural sensitivity and signed the deal there. So lost face, lost this guy a couple of million euros. It's a real thing, it's not a soft cultural thing. In terms of harder factors like law, the rule of law, I've already mentioned, it's the political rule of law. There is a move to reform law in China, and the fourth plenum that we've just had in the last week is all about increasing judicial independence. But it's not going to happen overnight, and you cannot make the same assumptions about the rule of law and the legal protections that you can when you're in Europe. But you can do things to maximize the protection that you can have. You also have to make sure that where you have specific issues like legal representatives in China, you know, this is something quite specific to China. The legal representative is the representative of the organization. If your legal representative does something wrong in China, your headquarters organization can suffer as a result. We have chops. These are the seals that people put on documents. There's a case down in South China at the moment where a British person had a joint venture with a big Chinese company. Somebody, he thinks the Chinese company, stole the chops from the company's safe, sold the assets of the company using the stolen chops, and now he cannot get those things back. They are legally sold, and he cannot get any help from the courts. Now, these are real issues that you have to be aware of that are different from those we face over here. Farpiaos is another one. Farpiaos are these tax receipts that people use very often to commit fraud in their accounts. It's probably the #1 way that people commit financial fraud in China, and this is something that you very carefully have to monitor. But again, it's a different way of doing things than we have here, so it needs special attention when you go into China. In terms of the practicalities, we also have to consider that, you know, if we're talking about an opportunity to fraudulently obtain a few hundred or a few $1,000s, we might, well, we might morally think it's just wrong and not do it, and so might somebody in China. But equally, they might think that a few $100s was worth the risk, or a few thousand, or a few $100,000. The perception of money is very different because many people have very little money. So if you have somebody who's earning $2,500 US a year, their ability to obtain additional money by fraud, even if it's only a few hundred or a few $1,000s, means that they might take that risk. They might be tempted to take the risk, whereas we as Europeans might think, well, it's just not worth it because it's such a small amount of money. Equally, we can be blinded by information overload. You can be deluged with data out of China, much of which anyway would be meaningless. But it's important that you can see through some of the data, your internal company data as well as the big economic data, to make sure that you don't get blinded by it. You need to understand the practical implications of these disparities, the practical implications of the data, and be able to see, sometimes with a bit of external advice or a trusted, experienced local advisor, what these things really mean and where the risks are. We're ready to go to the next slide. So when we're looking at managing these risks from a due diligence perspective, it's really important that we recognize the real problems that we face. And these are things we read about in the paper every day. I think you'll all have heard of the GSK example. This fear of bribery and corruption is very real. Now GSK, I mean, talking about taking the right tools to do the job, GSK have put a lot of emphasis on managing risk in their China operation. And they conducted something like 20 internal audits in the year before this corruption scandal blew up. One of them went on for 4 months, and they somehow managed to miss the fact that $500 million had been misspent. So again, if you take your Western glasses into a Chinese audit, maybe you're missing something very fundamental, like the fact that you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on travel expenses. It just doesn't make sense. You've got to look at it from local eyes. Caterpillar, they lost $580 million on an acquisition in China because their due diligence, as I understand it, was simply to see if the books added up. They didn't look at whether the business operation made any sense in relation to the books, something we'll look at in a minute. KFC, McDonald's, Aston Martin, lots of companies have failed in terms of vendors or supplier checks, in terms of looking at their supply chain due diligence. These are simple, low-cost things that people need to do to protect not only their profit this year, but also their corporate reputation and the long-term impact of product recalls, regulatory fines, which can cost hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars, but which come from headquarters and at a later date, so people tend not to account for them in their P&L. So don't ignore the warning signs and the red flags that you see in risk in your local operation. You've got to do something about it. So move on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, Jeremy, at this moment, at this point, I would like to interrupt you shortly with the question. You mentioned Guangxi, you mentioned bribes, and there is something coming into mind immediately with the question, when finishes Guangxi and starts corruption? And second question is, well, when a foreign businessman is approached and asked for a bribe, how to proceed, what to do? Do you have some?
Yeah, well, I think taking the second question first. I mean, I've never been asked for a bribe, and I've been running around China for over 20 years, and I know many people that have never been in that position. It's very often local staff that will be asked for a bribe or be aware of the opportunity to give or take a benefit. But of course it does happen, and my advice is usually to blame somebody else. Say, well, I understand your position, I would love to help, however, my company policy means I can't, or my financial director won't release any money, or the laws in my country mean that I simply can't do this, but let's see how we can make this deal work in a really positive way for both of us. So you just constantly bring it back to the advantages that your offer will give them as an individual and as a business, and you take the conversation back away from any improper business dealings. In terms of guanxi, as I say, there is a view that foreigners can't have guanxi anyway, but we do have to be aware of it. Now, where I've seen guanxi work most effectively is where there is no bribery, there is no corruption. It's simply people helping each other to make the right contacts, deal with things in an expedited way. So, for example, if you have a production due for Christmas and part of the factory burns down in your supplier, and that supplier is supplying 10 companies in Europe, which of those companies is going to lose the supply in time for Christmas? This is going to come down to your relationship or your guanxi with the vendor. So you have to have a good personal relationship. Obviously, if you send them a Christmas card, that's fine. You give them a pen, that's fine. If you're giving somebody an all-expenses trip paid to Disneyland, that's bribery. That's crossing a line. It's got nothing to do with the relationship. So you just got to be sensible. But I think most people know where the line is. It's just a question of not getting carried away because somebody makes a last-minute request.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I know that you are going on the following slides. You are going to speak about the due diligence. So let's launch our second poll. And the poll is, the question is, have you ever conducted any due diligence in China? And I would like to ask our audience to give us their view, whether they ever conducted any due diligence in China, either on a company or on an individual, on a product's manufacturer quality. Yeah, and votes are coming. And
we make sure everybody's still awake.
Yeah, I think we have more than 80 participants, and yeah, a lot of people are voting. Okay, I'm closing the polls now, and the results I am sharing now. 64 participants conducted due diligence on a company in China, 15 on an individual, 26 on a products manufacturer, and 10% of our participants, they conducted some other type of due diligence. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, very often when I'm doing due diligence projects on companies, the product review is very much a part of it. But yeah, it's interesting to see that breakdown.
Okay, so we are moving to approaches and tools.
Yeah. So I think when we're talking about the risk management in China or anywhere else, it's important that we have a strategic approach, that we understand that our objectives in doing the due diligence need to be clear. And depending on our corporate approach to risk and our personal appetite for risk, we have to have not only the strategy but also a process in place. So you have to think about whether you're going to be proactive or reactive. In my view, you have to be proactive wherever you can. Yes, you can be reactive where there's a problem, but usually it's too late. You know, you've already got a problem, and what you're trying to do is to minimize it for the future. What one of the interviewees in my book called if you'll excuse my French, the oh shit moment. You know, there's a problem, we have to do something about it. What on earth are we going to do? So I think you want to take early action. It's not expensive, but you have to have your due diligence in place before you start negotiating deals. You need to be clear about the due diligence process to protect yourself. Do you do it overtly or covertly? You know, is this a spy thriller or is this just a sensible piece of business? I think you need to do both. If you do overt due diligence, it's perfect for when you need to get information from your partner that is probably confidential to that partner. You cannot do that covertly, otherwise you will be committing a criminal offense of stealing commercial secrets. But some things you can do covertly. You can talk to business associates. You can go into a store and look at the product. You can talk to consumers. There are all sorts of things you can do covertly which are perfectly legal, which don't cross over any boundaries around privacy. But you need to do both. Do you investigate or do you review? This really comes back to the Caterpillar example. They, it seems, chose to review the accounts they had been given by the counterpart. They would have been much better off investigating independently whether overtly or covertly, the operation of the business to make sure that they had control of the process and didn't just rely on the information that was given to them. Because if somebody's wanting to commit a fraud, they will give you fraudulent information, and that information will look jolly good, but it won't be. And do you do this yourself or do you outsource it? Well, the tools that I'm going to talk about in a minute allow you to do a lot of it in-house, but you need to think about whether you have the skills, objectivity, and time to do all of these things. Nobody has any time these days to do it themselves. So sometimes for that reason, and to make sure that there's objective analysis, you need to outsource it. I was dealing with an American company the other day doing due diligence on a supplier for them. And I found very early on in the investigation that their corporate registered information conflicted with what they were saying in their brochures and in their meetings. And I said, they are lying. These people are dishonest. You shouldn't even bother to look at them in any more detail. And the American client came back to me and said, well, can't we just ignore that fact? Because we'd really like to deal with them. And I just sometimes scratch my head and think, why do people make these decisions? You need to be objective, and to be objective, you need to have options in your business. So that's also part of the risk management approach. So we go on to the next slide. When we are doing due diligence, when we're talking about due diligence, there are actually many different things that we need to think about, not just the very basic sorts of company checks that people often think about when they're doing due diligence. And in China, that's particularly important, partly because of the reason I mentioned, that we cannot make the same assumptions in China that we have in Europe. So if I look at a set of company accounts in the UK or in Europe, I know that those accounts have been audited by a regulated accountant, and that if there's a problem with it, the regulatory authorities and the courts will make sure that I'm compensated for any fraud. I simply cannot use the same set of assumptions when I go into China. So I can't just rely on doing legal and financial due diligence. I need to think about the political and regulatory due diligence. China is a political beast. The Communist Party is in charge. They publish their long-term policy agenda in the 5-year plan. We all have to read it. Regulations change very rapidly because China is still developing very rapidly. We need to keep up to date with it. You only have to look at things like the baby milk powder scandals, the anti-monopoly law actions, lots of things that happen that have a big impact on foreign companies that go well beyond the sort of legal and financial due diligence we're more familiar with. Commercial due diligence, this is something we need to do at a shortlist stage when we're dealing with companies. Does their business make sense? Does it look like they have sustainable competitive advantage in their business? And if you're looking at a partner, an acquisition target, a supplier, you've got to look at several of them, at least 3 to 5 in some detail, because my view is that the biggest reason people fail to manage their supplier and partner risk is because they don't give themselves options. Like my American client, they find they only have one option and they're against a deadline. You've got to give yourself options. That's one of the best ways to manage your risk. Operational due diligence, the key thing here is to go and look at the business. Don't look at the pictures on the internet. Look at the business on the ground. Have multiple site visits. Ideally, have more than one person go at a time so you can split up the management team in the local company. Go more than once because, to keep a factory or a business operating efficiently and cleanly on one day is fine, but to keep it going on day after day, month after month is much harder. Legal due diligence, of course it's important, but different assumptions apply. Sometimes there will be minor discrepancies that don't matter. Sometimes there will be really fundamental things that you need to worry about, including their legacy risk around compliance, taxes, the environment. These are all things that need to be checked. You also need to check you're dealing with someone who is the company's legal representative. You need to know who are the owners of the business. On the financial side, don't just look at the accounts. We know that Chinese companies often have more than one set of accounts, maybe one for the owner, one for the taxman. The record I've heard is one company having 12 sets of accounts, if you can believe it. You've got to look at the chain of documentation, the transaction records. If a lot of sales are going to a company, go and look at that customer company. Don't just take it for granted the accounts are real. In terms of compliance, this is obviously an environment in which the anti-corruption campaign is going on, but we also have environmental compliance, health and safety compliance. We have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, the Bribery Act in the UK. It's not just a Chinese thing, it's a global thing. The environmental impact and health and social due diligence. These are not optional things. They used to be, perhaps, but they're not optional now. And they're really important to look at in some detail because these have an impact on the bottom line as well as on the health and safety of your workers and your customers. Reputational due diligence is important, especially for business owners. You know, a business owner in China is like an emperor. They are all powerful. They sit at the top of the organization and there are no checks and balances on them. You need to understand your business partners' motivations, their history. How did they get where they are now? What relationships do they have? What risks come along with their opportunities that they present? In the same way, you've got to know your employees. Are they what they seem to be? People often inflate their CVs. A lot of people lie about their qualifications. It's amazing how few people actually check whether somebody has the degree they claim to have, and how few people make a call to a previous employer to make sure that there's nothing being hidden by that employee. On the most basic level, you look at their CV against their LinkedIn profile. I've done that in one case where the dates didn't match up. It was a clear red flag, and we were very quickly able to find out that the employee was lying about aspects of their history. These are not difficult things to do, but they are important things to do. So the next slide, please. So we go on to the toolkit. There are lots of tools that people can use to conduct due diligence in China. And these are both things that you can do online from your desk in Europe or in China, or some of them things that you need to be on the ground to do. But one of the first things to do is official searches. The Administration of Industry and Commerce holds records on every company in China, and although they are harder to access than they used to be, this is the first place that you should be looking. Most of the provincial AIC offices now have searchable online databases so that you can verify basic company details. You can verify the company name, the address, the chief representative, the legal representative, sometimes things like the shareholders, scope of business, these basic things. And you can cross-reference that with other records. You can look at whether that person who's the legal representative or the shareholder has other interests, maybe competing interests. This is absolutely essential. You can also look at court records. Again, a lot of these court records you can find online. Equally, you can look at the official government intellectual property sites to check who owns trademarks. It amazes me every time I sit down. I've done a lot of work with consumer-focused companies in the luxury sector, and I sit down with them again and again and say, have you protected your trademark in China? And they say, I'm sure we have. We have loads of lawyers. I'm sure they've done it. And we sit there in a meeting on my phone. I can look up the trademark on the registry in China and show them that maybe, or in one recent case, 6 different companies in China had registered their trademark in different classifications. So, you know, their business was making high-end fashion dresses, but people in China were registering their trademark for sunglasses, furniture, perfumes, all sorts of different things. They had absolutely no idea. It was easy to find out, and it would have been easy to buy up all those trademark registrations for a few $100s had they taken the time to do it. So use the official searches to find out business intelligence, but also to verify what people are telling you. So other online research you can do, obviously, do your Google search. One of the things that I use very often is Google Translate. Even if you can't read Chinese, you can set your computer using Google or other facilities to translate it for you. It's not perfect by any means, but it is very much better than flying in the dark into a far-off land. You can also look at media reports. You can often get credit reports online from sort of Dun & Bradstreet type organizations. Lots of things that you can do. One of my favorite things when I'm sitting with clients is to look at a supplier's website, and if you right-click on your mouse on one of the images from the website, usually of very impressive machinery or factory buildings, and you do a Google search for that image, very often you will find that a dozen or more companies are using the same image. It's just a reminder that what you see online might not be real, because only one of those companies that you see online can actually have it for real. Site visits I've mentioned, see it before you believe it. You've got to go and look at those sites. If you call me and say you want to do a site visit because you're stuck somewhere in Europe, I can have somebody on the ground in China, anywhere in China, within 24 hours for something like $500 US. Distance is not a barrier to doing this. You being stuck in Europe is not a barrier. You can get people at very low cost to go and have a poke around. And if you can't even do that, well, check out online Google Maps or Google Earth. You can actually have a look at where they claim to be. Is it an industrial area or is it a residential area? Simple things like that you can check for yourselves. But there's no substitute for a site visit. Equally, get business intelligence from doing interviews. If somebody says that they're the biggest supplier of a product in the local market, talk to their suppliers, talk to their customers, talk to, if you do a quick search on LinkedIn, you'll find former employees of that business. I've done that with a random coal mine in Shanxi through my LinkedIn network. I found the daughter of the former chief engineer of that company, who I got an introduction to, and who was very kind to talk to me about the history and the problems that company had faced. It is not impossible to do. But sometimes you do need to get professional assistance. As I said, it's important that you have an objective review of the findings, and sometimes it's simply not practical because of the location or the language or the technical issues involved. You need to bring in someone to help you with it. But whether it's getting somebody to do a site visit or a product inspection, whether it is someone to register a trademark, or do a little bit of local research. These do not have to be expensive things to achieve. Often you're talking a few hundred or a few $1,000s to do it, which is a lot cheaper even than getting a flight into the market. So next slide, please. When we are doing due diligence, we have to be a little bit flexible. You cannot rely on a very established checklist of the sort that you might have within your company for application to different things around the world. You have to localize it and make it flexible for China. I list several checklists in the book, one of which is the checklist designed by our very own EU SME Centre, which is fantastic. And of course I also recommend you download the due diligence report that the Centre has produced, which is again an excellent piece of work. But what I've done in analyzing a number of different checklists is to come up with some guidelines, a sort of checklist of checklists, if you like. And I think it's important to have the right approach. You've got to be objective, take a broad rather than a narrow approach to due diligence, and you've got to manage it in the local context. It's got to be localized, and you've got to maintain control over it so that the person on the ground doing the due diligence doesn't commit their own fraud against you, something else which is a risk. The context is important. You can't just look at the business partner or the business deal. You've got to look at the policy agenda around it. This political and regulatory due diligence in China is absolutely vital. And you've got to keep an eye on the commercial reality. Some of the things that we've already talked about that are different in China than they are over here. In terms of operations, there is no substitute for doing the operational due diligence. The legal and financial you've got to do, but you cannot ignore the operational due diligence. You've got to get on site, ideally yourself or subcontracted out. You've got to look at and understand the owners. And one of the tips that we have in the book is to look at the human resources records. While people spend a lot of time to falsify their accounts if they're committing a fraud, they very rarely bother to falsify the HR records. So are the right people in the right jobs? Are they qualified? Have they been there as long as they say they've been there? Are they being paid more than they should be for that type of position? And again, look at the chain of documentation in HR and in accounts. And verify. Trust, of course, but verify as well. Don't make assumptions. Take the information you're given, verify it against those government sources online and offline. Verify with people in your network. Find people who know that business, who know that person. Verify what they're telling you. At the very least, do the Google search, but at best, go through some of the processes we've discussed. So just to move on to conclude, the next slide.
We are slowly coming to the end of the webinar, and I would like to encourage our audience to send us their questions and use the experience and knowledge of Jeremy. And the question is on the right side, below part of the panel.
Yeah, so I talk about there being a new reality for risk in China, the new risk reality of China. It really is a challenging time for people in China. I'm sure all of you doing business there already know that. As we've said, costs are rising across the board. Costs of products, cost of employees, costs of compliance. At the same time, we're facing slower growth. Slower growth shows up problems that the good times used to hide. It was easy to show a profit when things were climbing very, very quickly, even if we lost things to theft and fraud and all the rest of it. In slowing times, these things are harder to hide. It's also more competitive than it's ever been because local and foreign companies are chasing the same business. And it means we need to reduce our prices and reduce our margins. We're making less profit. Makes life very difficult. But it also means that people are more inclined to bribe or commit other sorts of fraud to maintain their business margins, get their personal bonuses. As foreign companies, we're also being opened up to much greater scrutiny and regulatory risk. These are things we cannot ignore. If we break the rules, we will be found out and punished. So we need to take a much more strategic view of risk management. Risk management, in my view, is a core strategic issue, and it has to be a core part of the plan. And that is not only in terms of having a crisis management plan, it's about managing risk in a proactive way. We cannot afford to look at compliance as a box-ticking exercise. We have to make sure that our corporate values are deployed honestly and in the right way consistently in China, and that employees in the market don't have incentives to break those compliance rules. Equally, foreign firms need to be less foreign, frankly. The foreign firms will attract the greatest review from the regulators. We need to localize our businesses, support the local economy, pay our taxes, pay people sensible amounts of money, localize our operations so that we engage with and support the local communities. And we need to make sure that our ethics and our targets on which we're rewarded are aligned. Sometimes the right thing is going to be to say no to a deal. It's going to be to walk away from someone that wants a bribe. It's going to be walk away from a deal where the red flags say it's too risky. And we have to reward our staff and our local people for walking away just as we reward them for getting a deal done. Because the deal you do today, if it brings you a $500 million regulatory fine tomorrow, isn't going to look like such a good idea. So with that, I would like to conclude and wish you all a risk-free future for your business in China, or if it can't be risk-free, at least risk-reduced.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy, very much for your, knowledgeable presentation based on your long-term experience with managing risk in China. And we have now a few minutes for Q&A session. And we have received many questions. I will pick up only a few of them because we don't have time to answer all of them. And the first now is a question saying there are certain private investigation companies. What do you think about their position and the methods in the Chinese market? Yeah. Are they legal?
There are many investigation companies. You have the big international companies, which are famous around the world. They tend to be very expensive. You have a lot of smaller companies, some of which are run by foreigners, some of which run by local people, which have a very good reputation, often a very specialist area of expertise. Maybe it's financial or legal due diligence, maybe it's investigations, maybe it's product testing or pre-shipment inspections. So you can find a very specific service. What I would say is that you do have to ask them questions about their ethics and about their operations. There was a famous case of Peter Humphrey, a British investigator who's now in prison for, because he was accused of stealing personal data and using that in part of his investigations. So you have to be clear that the people you're dealing with are not breaking the law on your behalf. But I think there are lots of services. You talk to your local Chamber of Commerce, talk to me, talk to the EU China Centre, look at the listings, the expert advice listings on those websites of the chambers, and you will very quickly find people, or you can ask your contemporaries to recommend who they've used. What I would say is look for these service providers now, and ideally give them a small project. Just test them, build a relationship with them. Don't wait until you are in a blind panic because something dreadful has happened and find that you don't know anyone who can help you. So build the relationships now, use them in a small way over time, and if a crisis happens, you know who you can call. But yeah, you also need to be aware that even if you're a big international company with a good reputation, if your office is in Beijing and your staff are all Beijingers, they're not going to be much help to you if your problem is in Shanxi or Shanghai or Shenzhen. You've got to look at where people have the local contacts, the local dialects. So you want to have sector expertise, but also local expertise to make sure they can do a good job.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. That was the one and unfortunately last question for today. The rest will be answered via email. I would like to thank you once again for your presentation. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of sources available on a due diligence topic. I recommend your book, which is, perfect source of information about due diligence and how to manage risk in China, but as well
featuring, I should say, a very nice interview with Ludmilla.
And other sources which were published by our EU SME Centre, like Knowing Your Business, Due Diligence, and as well IPR SME Help Desk, which is a useful source of information how to protect your IP rights. So thank you as well to our audience for participating today. Next Tuesday we will have a webinar again on a legal topic. It will be about how to operate legally in China, and we will talk a little bit about trademarks, labor laws. So you are very welcome to join us.
Very good. Thank you very much, everybody, and feel free to let me know if there are any questions I can help with.
Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.